This is much of anything I do in the course of the year, in the sense to really be in town and have this chance to talk to you guys. I try to keep the subject in the area, and I always want to start just because somebody may not know, and I want you to realize that Byfield Parish is really just a territory. It's a parish. It's not a town. It has no town offices, although it does have a post office. But it really is now. It was originally part of two towns, Rowley and Newbury. That's how it began. Then, of course, Georgetown came into existence in 1838, and the section of Rowley that was Byfield, well, remained Byfield, but it now is the Georgetown section of Byfield. And then we built a new meeting house and opened it in '88. And when we did that, that meeting house is entirely in Georgetown. So we're strictly a Georgetown church. And just, for the record, so I'm not coming in from a foreign land. My kids all graduated from Georgetown High. But so I try to be as local and as hopefully interesting as possible in these opportunities to speak. And in a way, I regret myself that today I was speaking about Charles Beecher, and there was a man in town who was really an expert on that, and we just never quite connected, and that's too bad. Homer Taken. Homer really knew Charles Beecher's story, but I thought you might be interested in him, and let me tell you who he is and why he's so interested in himself, and then of course in being here at the church in Georgetown, which I'll explain. Let me give you a little bit of a broader background just to put him into context. Thank you. If you look at the American scene and try to, as I have, analyze it in a sense, where do we come from? Why are we who we are? Why are we this strange new country? How did we get away with it? How did 13 colonies get to bind together and beat the superpower of their day and age? What really was going on when you look at it? Now, I mean, historians have delved into that from time immemorial, at least in the country, and I'm not trying to say this is anything radically new, but I'm always trying to put the picture together. What really what was happening here? And if you get, here you have President Trump. Now, I'm not talking politics, and I don't care how you voted. That's not the point. But you've heard him say, we want America's greatness restored. That's been one of the themes. Well, that's one thing to say, but it's another thing to look and say, well, what was that greatness? Where did that greatness come from? What are we really talking about? And as I've looked over that at the American scene from my vantage point, now again, let me just keep telling you a little bit, tidbits at least, about where I'm coming from. The Byfield Parish Church is the first independent congregational church in America. It has that reputation. Well, that's the fact. And it makes that pulpit very interesting to stand behind and look at the American scene from. Because so much of what we appreciate in terms of, the Constitution, even the Declaration of Independence, certainly the Massachusetts Constitution that preceded the federal, where Massachusetts became a model in a way for the federal Constitution, in a remarkable sense, that came out of Byfield. It may sound a strange thing to say, or maybe an arrogant thing to say, but it's really true. I delivered a paper on this at Oxford, England, at the Oxford University, on the Byfield Parish Church as a forming of the American mind. So that's the background that we have as I say, out of our soil where we're sitting today and living. And when you then look at our American history and you try to get away from the biblical influence, you're wasting your time. Because the Pilgrims and Puritans both, who we see as so formative and so foundational, they both came, they had different ideas of why they came. The Pilgrims came to get away from trouble, The Puritans came to purify their own country by beginning a colony here that would be biblically based, and then they thought at the beginning they might transport themselves back to England and replant themselves in England as good seed and grow a purified England. That was their goal. They succeeded so well here, they didn't want to go back. Certainly their children had lands, and it became very prosperous here, and they stayed. But that was their original idea back in 1620 and 1630. So, but when you realize that, and you're looking at it, as I say, from my vantage point, which is behind the pulpit of this particular church that has so much influence. It really had great influence. By the way, I'll tell you how I started my paper over in England at Oxford. I quoted Edward Everett Hale. Some of you may have heard Man Without a Country. He wrote that book back in the Civil War period. Yeah. His uncle was Edward Everett. You'll see the Edward Everett Circle when you go through Boston, right? He was the governor of Massachusetts, but he was also the orator at Gettysburg. He delivered a 2-hour speech at Gettysburg, and the president, out of courtesy, was allowed to give greetings. We remember the greetings, all right. But nobody remembers Edward Everett. And his nephew became a very famous orator in his own right, Edward Everett Hale. And Edward Everett Hale is direct descendant of Moses Hale, who's the first pastor of the Byfield Parish Church. So he was invited back to Byfield in 1902. He was invited back to give the oration at the 200th anniversary. And he began, it has long since been observed that Newburyport, West Newbury, and Byfield, and he was thinking of the Newbury side of Byfield, form a sort of confederacy, and from this confederacy, nearly every name known to history in America has originally sprung. That was Hale in 1902 at the bicentennial. Well, I say if you look at the American scene and you're looking at it from the standpoint of the spiritual dynamics at work in the culture and the influence of the Bible and the thinking of the people. I'm not trying to say it's a Christian country, there's no such thing, but the Bible had an enormous influence on this country. It was in every home. People used biblical phraseology to express themselves. You listen to Lincoln's second inaugural, and you would think he's preaching it, not speaking it, because it was part of the culture as well as part of the life of the churches per se. So when you look back, it's very interesting to see that up until the 20th century, there was a pastor's family that was, I'll just say, prominent, but they were very influential, but very prominent on the American scene. And if you go back to the 17th century, 1600s, you'll find it was the Mathers, Increase Mather, Cotton Mather. This was the family of influence. They were the leaders at Harvard. It was really Increase Mather who stopped the Salem witch trial. So much false information out of the Salem witch trials, it's hard to cut through to what actually happened. But it was the pastors who stopped the witch trial. It was the magistrates that held them. And the pastor said, enough's enough. And Increase Mather was very influential in that. He was the main Boston pastor. So the Mathers were really a key family and a key influence in the 1600s, the 17th century. Coming to the next century, you have a remarkable awakening of the Christian faith, and the person, at least on the American side of the waters, who's identified with that is Jonathan Edwards. He was a pastor in Northampton. He was famous in his own day, in his own right. And his family was traced out, shall we say, by a historian, and they tried to assess. In fact, what they did was compared this crook in some prison in New York with Edwards, and what the crook cost the country and what Edwards gave the country. It was just quite a contrast there as to the family and how influential. You know, they were presidents of institutions. One of his I think it was a grandnephew, was the head of Yale, et cetera, et cetera. But you can argue that the Edwards family is very prominent in the 18th century, the 1700s. And again, if you look at it analytically, it's very arguable that because Edwards, as one of the prime leaders, but others who preached up and down the colonies, 13 colonies, preached the same gospel, created out of what was a string of European churches, the Congregationalists up here, the Catholics in Maryland, the Dutch Reformed over in Pennsylvania. They came from so many places. The Germans, a little later, yes, came with the Lutheran churches. And you think of the Dutch down in New York, where you have, those names still, even New York, one of the names that comes from that part of the old world. But after that Great Awakening in the middle of the 1700s, 18th century, this preaching of one gospel, not church form, not church politics, but just the gospel message, took those 13 colonies and gave them a reason to be together, where they had before that been looking to London and overseas for their contacts. Now they were with each other. And it really created a mindset that allowed for the Revolutionary War, so that they could bind together as with a certain oneness that was deeper than anything political or military or anything else. So, and the name of the family you think about in that century as central was Jonathan Edwards. And then if you jump to the 20th, I'll go back to the 19th in a minute. Then you go back to the 20th, you find that pattern was broken. And you don't have a pastor's family, a family connected with the life of the church. You have political families, the Roosevelts and the Kennedys. And they are the major families of the 20th century when you really think about it. And much of the changes have gone on because we get to think differently about who we are and how we ought to be together as a people. And now we've come to the 21st to a place where we're no longer political adversaries, which is fine. We're warring factions, which is not so fine if you want one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. But now let's go back to what I'm really about this morning, to that 19th century. 19th century, if you had the Mathers in the 17th, you had the Edwards in the 18th, you had the Beechers in the 19th century. One man about the period of time of the Civil War talking about the Beechers, he says, America has, how did he put it? Saints and sinners and Beechers. Because they were so prominent. They were so prominent. Lyman Beecher, who was born just 1 year before the Declaration of Independence and lived till the very middle of the Civil War, he was the Jonathan Edwards of the next generation. He was the Great Awakener, the second Great Awakener. And this awakening did something different than produce a Revolutionary War. It produced a different kind of society. It introduced all kinds of ways in which the Christian faith hit the ground. Like I'll give you one example, the YMCA. It's the Young Men's Christian Organization. But there were so many of these kind of movements that came out of the Second Great Awakening, and the Beechers were very central to that. Now, let me give you a few of the more prominent. Lyman had 11 children. The oldest was Catherine. Catherine was born in 1800. Catherine formed what was really, could have been arguably the first female seminary in America in Hartford, having women now trained for ministry. Not just, before that, most of the girls, the women, were trained in the domestic art. This was a school for women to be trained in ministry. It was a female seminary. It is very interesting to us at Byfield because the Massachusetts Seminary for Women is in Byfield. It was formed in 1807. This was not the Beechers, but it was formed by a deacon of the Byfield Parish Church, and just out of your interest, when a doctor out in, I think I tried to say Brookfield, that's the wrong name, it'll come to me. But anyway, out by Mount Holyoke, sent his daughter to Byfield to study in the seminary, because he had the money to do it. There was a girl who was a friend of his daughter's, young woman, and he sent her as a companion for his daughter to come here to Byfield because Byfield was so far away in 1807 from Springfield and the like. And that little girl's name was Mary Lyon. And Mary Lyon took the Byfield model and founded Mount Holyoke College for Women. And her death was mourned on all 7 continents in the world when she died. Now, this was a big change in the American scene, and it was certainly a wonderful change for young women. Well, that was Catherine Beecher. Edward Beecher is interesting to Byfield and the Georgetown end of it, like I'm saying. But Edward Beecher became friendly with Elijah Parrish Lovejoy. He was born in 1803. So was Elijah Parrish Lovejoy. Elijah Parrish Lovejoy was named for the 3rd pastor of the Byfield Parish Church, Elijah Parrish. And he, Elijah Parrish Lovejoy, was an abolitionist. And he took the hotbed issue in Byfield out of his own home. His father went to the Governor Dummer Academy when it was a fledgling school, and in Byfield they were fighting a big battle because the most prolific anti-slavery writer in America at the time was Deacon Benjamin Coleman of Byfield, and his pastor owned 3 slaves. Now can you imagine what was going on at church meetings with a rabid anti-slavery man in the diaconate post, and your pastor has 3 slaves. So this was a major issue during our American Revolutionary War and just beyond. And Daniel Lovejoy had come from Albion, no, it is Albion, Maine. And he came down with no money. Elijah Parrish gave him a room and board in the parsonage. He went home and named his first boy Elijah Parrish Lovejoy. At the same time that this was going on, John Adams sent John Quincy Adams to Byfield to learn law under the son of the Byfield pastor. He also was John Quincy Adams, very anti-slavery, if you look at the founding fathers and the early presidents. Elijah Parrish Lovejoy was finally killed protecting a printing press in 1837 on the banks of the Mississippi, and his friend at that time was Edward Beecher. So Edward Beecher had this part to play with Parrish, and when Parrish was killed, John Quincy Adams, who knew the background because he'd been here in Byfield, said, "Mark me, that was an American earthquake." In other words, that will end slavery one way or the other, and it eventually did. So Edward Beecher was involved in that. And then you come a little later down, 1811, and Harriet was born. Harriet Beecher, who married Stowe. And we know a great deal about Harriet because when she was introduced to President Lincoln, he said to her, "So you're the little lady that started this great war with Uncle Tom's Cabin." Well, she had a younger brother, Charles, who was born in 1815. And Charles Beecher, as a young man, was in New Orleans, and he was really uncertain in his own life. He was just floating around, but he would write back to Harriet about the treatment of the blacks.
Thank you.
The treatment of the blacks in the New Orleans area, and those letters became, in many ways, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So he was very influential in Harriet's life. All that to say this: that finally, when Charles really was seeking a pastorate, he was called to the Georgetown Congregational Church. Charles Beecher was at Georgetown here from 1857, I think it was, till I think it was 1870 when he left. He was very controversial. He was a Beecher. That made him important in American history. In fact, his brother, I left him out, but Henry Ward Beecher was a preacher down in New York, and at the time considered the most famous, let's call it that, famous preacher in America. And the rumor is that Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, would go incognito to New York to consult with Henry Ward Beecher on war policy.
Didn't the parish itself some of the members try to oust him from?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They had a trial.
Yeah.
It wasn't just bad feelings. They really went after him. around the time of the Civil War. He was here, he was a very controversial figure. He lost two children, two daughters, Harriet and, Hattie and Elsie, drowned in Pentucket Pond. That was really a very powerful, well, obviously a crisis, you lose your child, but it was a powerful moment in his life. Excuse me. But Charles was the more artistic, and that's what kind of got him into trouble with the Georgetown membership, because he would go on flights of fancy in his preaching, and they wanted to stick straight to the biblical word and all. And they finally brought him up before, when I say trial, before the Association of Churches to be tried. Now he was exonerated. He stayed here till I believe I'm right in the date of 1870. But I just, when you paint the bigger picture of the 19th century America, and you realize the profound influence of the Beecher family, I just thought it would be very interesting for you to know that one of the 11 was right here in Georgetown, and here for about a decade and a half as the pastor of that church. So, I don't know if you have any I don't know if I can answer any questions beyond it, but that's where I wish I had talked to Homer Tapin. Homer was quite knowledgeable of Charles. He studied him pretty well. But go ahead.
So, Bill, you were saying that was it Charles Beecher?
Charles.
Right.
Yeah, Charles.
That he was actually experiencing things happening down south that he wrote to Harriet about?
Before he came here, he was living in the New Orleans area, and he would write back to Harriet. And Harriet used a great deal of what she got from Charles when she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Yeah, so that was the connection here with Georgetown. What really happened between, just to kind of summarize it, the Beechers, now Charles died in 1900, he was born in 1850, 85. His father, who was such an influence on that family, I mean, Lyman Beecher was a very powerful influence, and they loved him. It wasn't forced, it wasn't a harsh thing. They were just so, I don't know if the word impressed is right, but certainly they were so, influenced is a good word, influenced by their father that he carried on in his 11 children one way or the other. But I tell you, he was born in 1775, which is 1 year before the Declaration, and then Charles, we're talking about, he was the longest lived of the children. He lived till 1900. And really that family and that generation moved from Puritanism, because Lyman Beecher, the father, was the last of the real Puritans. They're very, very strict in their legal understanding of how the faith should be enacted in the life of the churches, to the more permissive world we were born into, which began to come about at the beginning of the 1900s, and the 20s and the flappers and on you go with the change in the culture. That generation, that century that spanned it was really the century of the Beechers. So again, to quote the Yale president who said, America has saints and sinners and Beechers. And one of the Beechers was right down the road here in Georgetown.
Where was the female seminary in Byfield? Was it originally?
It's still there. No, it's seminary now. But if you visualize the Byfield Parish Church where we are, and that's Elm Street till it gets to Georgetown, that becomes Jackman,
Right.
just this line in the road. When you go across this to the Newbury side and you head to Governor Dummer,
Right.
and Central Street comes in, you visualize.
Yeah.
You know the house across the way is owned by Jesperson?
Yeah.
In fact, if you watch TV, you see Jesperson all the time. They had it for Honda. I think it's Honda. He comes on and says, "Buy it." Isn't it Honda? Marshall Jesperson. That's Marshall's house. That house, I'll tell you a little bit more than you asked about it. But what happened was, Byfield had a very controversial pastor in this Elijah Parrott, who I referenced. And he's the third pastor. He came in 1787, and he was there till 1825. And in the middle of his time there, he was very controversial. And he was moving more quote-unquote liberal in his theology, and there were a lot of the old-time Calvinists in the church that didn't like it. They finally pulled out about 12 years after he arrived. And they decided to have their own church, their own building and everything. So they, again, I don't know how much you travel around Byfield, but if you leave up by the Byfield Parish Church, you go down Central Street over the bridge to the river, you know, the falls. And on the right, well, now there's a new fire station there, you know, protection number 1. Yeah. Just past that, I think I'm ahead of it, right? That's before Larkin Road. Larkin Road cuts off there and goes down, yeah. And right across from Larkin Road, they built a second Byfield Parish Church. Yeah, this group that pulled out. And that would be about 1798. And they hired a new pastor, and Elijah Parrish stayed with the remnant of the flock up at the church up in what they call Old Byfield. But it became clearer in a short time, year or two, that this was not working, because neither church had enough people to support either one. So they decided, on practical terms, we got to come back together, or we're just struggling. And there was a lot of hostility at the time, because I'm sure the parents were talking about the other church, and they didn't like leaving. So you know how kids take it; they would go down and break the windows in one of the churches just as a show of their disrespect. And it was, so all these problems were piling up. So in 1800, they decided to come back together. And that deacon who was anti-slavery, I mentioned, Benjamin Coleman, he buys that church building, and he moves it up to where that's Jesperson's house today,
Okay.
with the 2 pillars
Right.
in the front. Yeah, and that's the old Byfield Parish Church.
All right.
Yeah, it moves up there. Now he's got, and then he's the one, Coleman's the one who hires Emerson, Joseph Emerson, to be a teacher. And in 1807, because the whole thing's taking place around between 1800 and 1807, he hires him to come, and they establish a female seminary there.
Okay.
If you go by there, take a look at the 2 pillars out front,
Right.
and you'll see there's a stone marker on there that says Seminary 1807. Yeah, you'll see it. So
Was that the one that earlier in my generation with the military academy?
yes.
Yeah,
That's
I
it.
remember it in that way.
When I came, it was a military academy downstairs and a Calvin seminary upstairs. Yeah, that was quite a combination. But anyway, yeah, and then Marcia married Jesperson, and Marcia Van Fleet was her name when I first knew her. Married Marshall Jesperson, and they bought that house and they revamped it. So that's the seminary.
Is it obvious from the road, the little plaque?
Yeah. If you pull up and look at their driveway, and you'll see there's 2 prominent stone pillars.
Right.
And I think it's on the right-hand one, you'll see, it might be a land design, I can't remember the number, but it's right there, and it's right in the,
Very interesting.
and it says Seminary 1807.
Cemetery Military Academy, right?
Yeah. Well, the military academy took it over later. It was, I don't know how long the military academy
Yeah,
was
I
there.
forget when they closed.
Well, it was after we came. It was the military academy when I came to Byfield, that was 69. So,
Upstairs was praying for downstairs. Upstairs was praying for
that's
downstairs.
right, yeah. And the downstairs are protecting the upstairs.
There you go.
Yeah.
When did it close as a
Well, I
seminary?
guess, I don't know, I'd say around the time, I have to date things by events, but the Spavaland Mansion burned in 75. I think it was a Labor Day weekend. And about that time, the seminary was closing. I mean, not seminary.
Military.
Military.
Military camp,
Pastor Boylan, I've been following you on the radio for years, and I really appreciate meeting you today. Where do you get your enthusiasm? Where did this all come from?
It's my wife. She's, get going. Don't leave it all to me.
You have a love for history.
I do. I have an undergraduate degree in history and political science, and then was called at the end of college to the seminary. And I guess God in his grace knew he was gonna put me in this particular historic church. And, yeah, so, and I just love the opportunity. Right now, I'm in transition right now, just for you to know. I'm not leaving the church because I'm still gonna be a member and I'm not going anywhere, but I won't be the senior pastor after the end of April. I will be, and really, it's a good move because radio is opened up in a wide way right now. We'll see where it ultimately goes, but I'm on Boston radio every day. Yeah, I have a 1-minute spot that plays daily on 3 stations, and then a 1-hour program on Saturday that takes that 1-minute spot, whatever it's talking about, and fleshes it out. And then I still have the Discoveries on Sunday morning, and then Byfield Parish Past and Present Sunday afternoon. And they also play on Newburyport Sunday morning and Monday night. So I have all of that every week.
Are you syndicated? I mean, do you?
No, I have.
Because they could sell that like they do.
Well, the reason I'm on daily now in Boston is because New York approached me about 2 years ago now and asked me to consider going national on all 160 of their affiliates. So right now, Boston's been testing it for about 2 years.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for your good work. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's, we just love having you.
Well, I love coming,
And-
so it's a
And
mutual.
I'm very glad to think that you won't be too far.
No,
And you
we'll be,
can
no, we'll be.
practice even if we didn't ask you to speak. You just have, now that you have all this.
Yeah,
stuff in your head.
that's right, that's right. No, we're gonna be living in the apartment, we'll be right there.
Oh, good.
And we're not moving out, but this role will be different. Yeah.
But thank you so much. Because, every time he comes, it's amazing because there's always something new.
And you got a full house each night.
I know, always.
I'll never be
Which is,
able to
you know
stop
what,
it.
That's, you really welcome that too. Because now,
No, I-
accommodate a full house and you can stay and have
Yeah.
fun. So next month, Dr. Dan Boylan will be with us. And if you've got any thoughts about some of the things that you'd like Dr. Dan to talk about, let me know, because we've been emailing back and forth, and he thought, if there's some education ideas or things you'd like him to handle as a topic, let me know, so we can get them to him, and he can include that in his guest appearance next month in April. So,
They can't find anybody
And-
to take it place.
just very glad to have, it was very nice, the first event that we had here was our men's breakfast in February. It was like, we weren't sure how we were gonna work, because we hadn't moved in to the rest of the building, but we had this area ready, and we were like, we're just gonna go for it. This is the way to get started, but then this is really, like the first real, that we've got everything in, and, we'd already, that day we were just washing the plates and putting things away before we served breakfast, and we didn't know where anything was. I had stuff all over the counters. This morning, we knew where things were, so we could find the cups. So I'm very glad.
You didn't have to run
all-
off the sausage today?
I didn't have to, I know, that was that we had a freezer issue nope, everything's working, and
I'd like to give a round of applause to you and the kitchen staff.
well, thank you. I know, again, it's wonderful to have the help.
Yeah.
We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
But thank you for coming. We'll see you we'll get together next month. If you've got some thoughts for Dr. Dan, tell me. And then we'll figure out from there. Perfect, thank you so much.